Subcommittee will reconvene. I thank the witnesses for their patience, and we're missing Mr. Murray, but I suppose he'll join us in due course.
Can I go?
No, I'm actually going to wait.
Oh,
I'm going to ask another question or two. With your indulgence. Yes. I was interested in the testimony that was provided by a number of the witnesses regarding the current roaming rules, and I would like to just ask each of you if you want to comment on this. Given the importance of the growing use of mobile data and the fact that so many people are now relying on their mobile devices as a major internet access and email application. In fact, I've got an iPhone. I guess I probably shouldn't advertise particular products, but I like it a lot. And I'm probably using that for email more now than anything that sits on a desk. And I'm sure that there are millions of other people having similar experiences with that device or other similar kinds of portable devices. And so given the growing importance of mobile data uses, has the time come, in your opinion, for us to provide automatic roaming rights for data similar to the automatic roaming rights that exist for voice services today? Mr. Murray, you've joined us, and we'll ask you first if you would like to comment.
I think absolutely the answer to that is yes. We value competition, and we value rural consumers being served as robustly as urban. That's part of the promise of universal service. And unquestionably, these smaller carriers will tell you they can't get data roaming. It's not that it's been taken away, it's just never been there. And so I think we've absolutely come to the point where this is essential. If we want to not hit a brick wall and see consolidation really accelerate, I think data roaming is essential.
Others care to comment? Very briefly, my time really has expired. Mr. Meena.
I wanted to comment on that because it is such an important issue. Yes, all carriers need access to automatic data roaming. The VoIP example I gave in my testimony is a perfect example. In the future with 4G, is VoIP voice or is it data? Why would it matter? And there are countless telemedicine and other applications that customers need to use in their home footprint as well as they travel anywhere throughout the country. And that is a goal of ours, to provide the type of services that customers want no matter where they go.
All right. Anyone else want to offer a view? Mr. Irving?
I would agree that now is the time for data roaming to also be included in carriers' common carrier obligations. We've begun entering into data roaming agreements generally with smaller and mid-sized carriers who tend to be more receptive to those roaming agreements. I would add one clarification. You asked whether we should enter into data roaming agreements or data roaming obligations similar to the voice roaming obligations. We'd like to see the voice roaming obligations improved and the data roaming.
I understand that. Mr. Schieber.
Yes, Sprint spent billions of dollars on its EVDO network, and we, as we've seen competition unfold, we are increasingly open to considering people who want to roam on our EVDO network. Whether we need automatic roaming as we have with voice or not is an open issue, I think. I will say, though, that if we have to have something like that, the in-market exception really needs to be addressed so that we are all on the same level playing field. The in-market exception precludes us from getting roaming from folks, or if we have spectrum in a particular market. So addressing that issue in that context would be very helpful.
This would be spectrum you have in that market that you haven't built out in yet, presumably.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. All right. Mr. Upton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ford, I have the results of the Consumer Reports excuse me, most recent wireless survey, which was published in January of this year. They concluded that, one, overall cell phone service has become significantly better. Two, contract terms for cell phone services are less onerous, and there were fewer problems with call quality in this year's survey, which obviously is 08. There was substantial improvement over the 07 survey results. and that there has been a surge in satisfaction. Those are their words. In your testimony, you stated that the wireless industry is in fact workably competitive, and I know that as an economist, and consumer satisfaction surveys may not be the tools of your trade, but would you agree that these positive consumer satisfaction surveys results are consistent with what might expect from consumers enjoying the benefits of a competitive marketplace?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's I think to some extent that the progression of the industry is part of the dynamic competitive nature of it, and you would expect things to change and improve over time. And with the advent of new services and broadband and new telephones, people are going to get increasingly happy. And we're looking at nearly 20% of the people falling off the wireline network. The mobile service would have to get better for that to happen. So sure, it's very consistent with that outcome.
Thank you. Mr. Schieber, AT&T and Verizon claim that CLECs and other proponents of special access reform have not provided comprehensive data on their networks as the Bell companies have. Are you willing to provide the FCC with the same data that the Bell companies have given the FCC?
Congressman, we respectfully disagree with AT&T and Verizon. We feel like the FCC has a strong record of evidence. The FCC has what they need to act on this. However, if there's additional information that we can provide that would help the FCC get better clarity into the state of competition and special access, we're more than happy to provide that. But we would like the FCC to act on that and act on it quickly, though.
So is the FCC, do they have any outstanding requests in for more information at this point or not?
Not aware of any outstanding requests at this point. I think that they are working on something at this point, a request for information.
Thank you. Mr. Potharlanka, in my view, we squandered an opportunity to make sure that backhaul capacity was available when we gave the white spaces away rather than auction them off. Do we still have an opportunity to correct that mistake in the FCC's reconsideration of the white spaces order?
Our general opinion about the white spaces, the channels available in the white spaces in rural areas is that we could actually have multiple uses for it. Okay, I think several applications can coexist, and we're not sure that limiting options is the right way to do it, either through an auction process or a.
But if they're valuable, why wouldn't we all benefit if they had been auctioned off rather than parts of it given away?
We're not disagreeing whether there will be enhanced value out of it. All we're saying is there are some parts of the spectrum, I think, which are best served by set aside for certain types of applications, where you would be able to enable broadband over extended distances. And I think what we're proposed is we want to have multiple applications coexist at the same time. And I think different types of approaches could be used to putting that spectrum to work.
Well, do you think that they ought to be used for unlicensed parts of the? Should they allowed to be? Should those white spaces be allowed to be unlicensed?
Sure. Yeah. We believe that our proposal, and let me touch on that specifically. Our proposal specifically states that we would like a few channels in the rural areas be allocated for point-to-point licensing in a manner that they can coexist with incumbents as well as allow for unlicensed devices to operate. And there's a way to do it. There are lots of rural areas where you have 15 sometimes, all the way up to 40, 45 channels. And I think the trick is to figure out a mechanism where you can actually have a lot of these things coexist. And it's possible given the amount of spectrum that's available.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Upton. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses. I think it's been a terrific panel, and I think that you've built a very strong case around the whole issue of whether we have real competition and what the outcomes are if we don't, and the state of affairs that we're in. Dr. Ford, I don't have a question for you, but there's two things that really take my breath away about what you said, and that is that a duopoly is natural. I have to tell you, that just flies in the face of what I think America is about and what our whole system and belief in competition. I just don't buy into that, and so I needed to comment because I still can't get it out of my head. But at any rate, I want to talk. I focused on special access in my opening comments, and while I think much of the focus on special access has been the competitive issues that result for wireless companies, who due to a lack of competition and choice have to pay largely whatever the incumbent Bell company decides. What I want to touch on is the broader impact of this bottleneck in the middle mile. Now, for years, I worked very hard on HIT legislation, on getting the legislation passed here. We were successful in getting substantial funding, so we got the policy. Then we got significant funding in the stimulus package, and that's going to create jobs. It's going to build an infrastructure to reduce health care costs. It's going to help reach people who don't have immediate access to hospitals. But my question is, in listening to the panel and examining this issue, how are these hospitals and other providers who don't have immediate access to the network to transmit large amounts of healthcare data, health records, MRIs, X-rays, and the rest, how are they going to get this to providers and to patients? I mean, we kind of dive down into a whole alphabet soup of the telecom industry here, and yet members need to really understand that because of these bottlenecks, the work that we've already done and we're congratulating ourselves for, how is this going to work? So I pose that question to you. I mean, it's special access services. And we're preparing ourselves for an energy bill. The smart grid has to be a part of it. The data transmission requirements to monitor, to send information, control the flow of energy access, energy across the grid has to be in a very intelligent and efficient manner, and it will be substantial. And again, we bump up against special access fees. And I just want to put my own personal example on the table, and that is last year I explored the possibility of installing Cisco's telepresence technology in both my DC and Palo Alto office. And while it was fairly expensive, it was going to really do a lot for us and my constituents. But what we couldn't afford out of our budget was the monthly cost of the special access lines that were needed. They were in the range of $2,000 a month. So, I mean, I just start with my own operation on that. So I open it up to the entire panel on the special access fees and the exploration of these very key areas that we need, you not only need, but we need to operate, to transmit information, and we have the information technology, but in the 21st century, with these fees, I think that we're in real trouble. We're saying on the one hand, congratulations, Congress, we did all of this, but look what these special access fees are doing. So whomever would like to comment, I think Dr. Ford's not going to agree with me, so the rest of you can chime in. But congratulations, Dr. Ford. There aren't too many people that leave a few words with me that will remain just about forever. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I'd like to try to answer that. Anytime you have two carriers that have a disproportionate power, then the prices that you experience are going to be prevalent. And the way to solve that is allow more competition, or maybe a light touch of regulation that will stimulate those duopolistic providers to do what they need to do. We have that same issue in the handset arena. They are the larger carriers are coalescing and bringing together market power to acquire the largest, a significant number of the most attractive handsets, and we are not able to provide those to our customers because of this market power that they exert. So that's why it's so important that that Congress step in and require that companies like us can sell the handsets we want, and that other companies can get into the special access business and do what they need to do to provide services at rates that are competitive.
Now, the chairman said something earlier, which was a very good question, asking about the stimulus funds and making use of them in order to, if I heard it right, to accomplish the goal of what some of us would like to see in policy. I think straight away we need a new policy. I want the companies to make good use of the stimulus funds, and I'm proud that we did what we did for underserved and unserved areas, and it's a good place to start. But I don't think that takes the place of a policy. But anyway, I think others of you wanted to weigh in on what I raised.
If I may add something to this,
Sure.
in terms of the specific example of a hospital needing access to
Exactly.
is a great one. The key is to create alternatives so that these costs go down. That's the key.
Right.
Trying to regulate this, I'm not sure in the medium to long term actually serves the purpose. So we need to create alternatives by enabling investment. And so our thought is, and this is what I think we as a company have been doing for some time, is make sure that we invest capital where we create broadband hotspots, places across the nation where various entities can have equal access to bandwidth. It could be a hospital, it could be a government facility. Frankly, it could be any of the wireless carriers, which is who we focus on today. But frankly, it could be anybody else. And I think under the stimulus program and the BTOP program, I think we have a unique opportunity to direct some of those funds to creating broadband hotspots so that we get the multiplier effect of opening broadband up to a larger community of users and not focused on just one segment of the marketplace. And we also believe that approaches like this could be expanded on an ongoing basis, much beyond the stimulus program.
I'll just add briefly that I think Mr. Potharlanka is right, that we need alternatives, but at the same time, when we see data that show that in some places we've got profit margins exceeding 125% on these services, we have to acknowledge that there will be some places where there will not be alternatives, whether that's rural areas, whether that's just areas of the country that get left behind for whatever reason. And for those areas, the question is, are we just going to orphan them?
Not a natural duopoly.
Right.
There's hope for a lack of that somewhere.
Yeah, and I will tell you, 96% of our cell sites are served by the ILEC. 96% of the special access we buy.
96% are?
96%. 96% of the wireline special access that we pay for is paid to the ILEC. In all honesty, in the interim, in the short term, I would be happy with a duopoly. It is not a duopoly; it's a monopoly today. We need to have more competition, and the broadband stimulus funding, may be an option down the road. It may be an opportunity, but in all honesty, we have a short-term issue. I don't think that we can predict that will necessarily solve the special access problem. It is an operating expense problem we have. The broadband dollars are spent on capital. That's great. Support that. But we have an operating expense problem in this nation with respect to special access, and it is a monopoly right now. We have extremely difficult terms and conditions we have to put up with the LECs, and support that.
Thank you very much. I think you've been a terrific panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing them to answer the question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Escher. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll probably take a little bit a different approach than the gentlelady from California. She indicates this. She goes on to talk about the state of affairs we're in and that these bottlenecks. But if you look across the world and you see the concentration, the United States is more competitive than almost all the other countries. Isn't that true, Dr. Ford, that, that I think out of all the OEC countries, United States has more. I mean, we have AT&T, Verizon. The Sprint is in the mix, and so is T-Mobile. So isn't it true that, contrary to what the gentlelady said, the United States that has more competition than almost any other country in the world? Is that true? Yeah. And Dr. Murray, I know you're talking about these 125%, and that's probably access, and Sprint is very aware of that. And I think Sprint makes a very good point. You know, the other side, the evidence shows that the market's competitive. You know, the real larger question is, can you have a large wireless market with 12 carriers, or is it going to come down to 3 or 4? And I think there seems to be some quantitative law here that when you get this kind of market, to have the capital to invest and to have the innovation that's required, you probably can't have 12. And so, Dr. Ford, you might want to just touch on that, because it appears to me that if we're the most competitive in the world, there is a quantitative rule that says you've got to have at least maybe just 2 or 3 that can carry the load.
Absolutely. I mean, we regulated the electricity business. We regulated the local telephone business for years because it was a natural monopoly.
Yeah.
Only one firm could survive. And as technology has developed, we've created opportunities to get costs down and to have more firms. Markets grow, costs go down, we can have more firms. So, yeah, I mean, our policy paper 21 sort of lays out the economics of what these industries are going to look like using formulas. I mean, basically, there is a formula to tell you what this industry is going to look like.
Now, recently the FCC came out with a report, and this is what they said. They were talking about the commercial mobile radio services. They said the metrics indicate that there's an effective competition in the wireless market, and demonstrate the increasingly significant role that the wireless services play in the lives of American consumers. So the FCC sort of agrees with you, Dr. Fox, and this is a recent report this year which indicates their competition. Notwithstanding that fact, Mr. Schieber, Mr. Upton asked you the question about advocating increased special access regulation. You know that U.S. Telecom sent a letter to the FCC outlining a lot of questions. And you've seen this report, have you?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So they're indicating that the evidence shows the market's competitive. You're indicating the market isn't. So the incumbent phone companies submitted this filing with the FCC listing the type of information that needs to be collected to answer this question, which is a fundamental question for this hearing today. Do you agree that these questions are relevant? You obviously have read them. Do you think they're pertinent and would provide us an answer whether the market is competitive or not?
I think it's very relevant.
Just bring the mic up a little closer.
Sorry. I think it's very relevant to determine whether the market's competitive. You know, I can speak from personal experience in managing access on a day-to-day basis, Congressman, that it is very difficult to find alternatives to the incumbent LECs. You have to look at the complete circuit that is being provided, the whole middle mile facility. There are certain portions of the middle mile facilities where there is more competition than the others, but for that very last mile in the middle market facilities, there is very little competition.
So we have these questions from the incumbents and others, and they submitted them. And you say these questions are pertinent. By and large, you agree with these questions. I guess the real question is, if the FCC answered this question, could they make an objective decision whether there is enough competition in the market?
We believe that the FCC...
No, just a yes or no on this. And these questions that are in there that you've read, would you say, yes, these are sufficient to answer your concern about whether there's market competition or not?
No, sir. I think
Okay.
there are other questions.
And would you also, your group and others, provide another list of questions that you think are more pertinent so we can solve this question from the FCC standpoint? Because I think as members of Congress, this is so difficult for us to regulate. I think the gentlelady from California mentioned possibly we should step in, but I think many of us are sort of, trying to sort this out, and maybe the FCC can do this instead of the government, the United States Congress, coming in here and mandating this thing. So we're trying to say, look, the U.S. Telecom has these list of questions. You don't think they're pertinent. Do you have your own set of questions that you and your group could submit so that the FCC could make an objective analysis?
We would be happy to, Congressman. As I said earlier, We honestly believe that the FCC has all the information necessary to make this determination. But if there's additional information that we can provide, we'll be happy to. If there's additional questions that we think they need to be asking, we'll be happy to provide those questions. With all due respect, what we'd really like is for the FCC to act. This issue has been with them for 6 years.
So the FCC, in your opinion, does not need these questions from the U.S. Telecom Association to bring bearing an answer to this because they already have the information.
I think there are questions that are relevant besides the ones that the ILECs have.
Do you think these are self-serving then? Is that what you're saying?
Without question, sir.
Okay. So, Dr. Ford, what is your feeling? Can the FCC determine this based upon the information they have without these questions? Or you probably haven't seen these questions, but I think many of us would just like the FCC to act. And in all respect to Sprint, they've got a good point. If the information's there, why isn't the FCC acting? Or are you going back on your original statement is that there is sufficient competition that the FCC does not have to act?
I don't know how much competition there is in special access, and nobody knows how much competition there is in special access. They keep doing these huge studies. The NRI just did a study, the GAO has done studies, and every time they come back with these studies, they say, well, the data's really bad, and we need to do something else. The FCC needs to collect more data. I mean, the evidence, I don't know, but the evidence for regulating special access tonight is really pathetic. I mean, if there was a 138% rate of return on special access, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
Mr. Murray says it's 125%. Isn't that what you said, Mr. Murray?
I mean, it's just insane. These are regulatory books that the FCC has rejected as being relevant to this proceeding. The FCC, they collect the data and present it to people, and they say this is not relevant. I mean, 138% rate of return? I mean, we'd all be building plant. We'd be nuts not to. It just doesn't make any sense. But that doesn't say that they don't have a point, okay? The point is that somebody needs to get in there and do a really serious job and get data from everybody, because if there's going to be 2 or 3 people providing service, okay, you can't miss one. I mean, if you don't have data from one guy, you've missed everything.
Madam Chair, I've asked my question. Is there anybody else on the panel that would like to tackle this in addition to Dr. Ford and Mr. Schieber? Anybody else? Yes, Mr. Murray.
I guess I just want to challenge the economics for a brief second. I'll
Sure.
humbly do so, since I am not a tenth of the economist that Dr. Ford is. But classic monopoly behavior is not, hey, let's figure out how much output we can get out there. Let's produce the maximum amount. It's quite the opposite. Classic monopoly behavior is let's reduce output so we can raise price on the services that we have. And, we're seeing, like, I mean, I guess, would anybody deny that in more than 90% of U.S. markets, there's only one choice for special access? Is anybody going to deny that fact? Because I don't think anybody will challenge that. And that looks like a really concentrated market to me.
Look, we have 95% of people in this country had a telephone, and it was served by a monopoly. Okay, so restricting output is kind of silly in this business. The carriers are required to provide service to people. Okay, it's not a choice of restricting output. And if you're going to choose, if there's an output level that's been chosen, then the pricing is a little bit tricky. Okay, because you're not just going to put it out there and then not do anything with it. I mean, it's sunk. If you make a marginal profit, a monopolist would make a marginal profit on it. So the argument is not correct.
Thank you.
Too bad Judge Black isn't still alive to come and testify. Let's see, just exercising the prerogative of the chair, which I very, very seldom have ever had. I think that just to set something down for the record, in terms of competition, and it's the foreign markets have been referred to, they do regulate. They do regulate the top, but they also insist that there's regulation of the wholesale market. And there is a difference, Mr. Stearns, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. As I said before, the debate over special access should really be called critical access, because these special access lines are critical to broadband deployment and competition. These lines allow America's businesses to bring innovation and development to far-flung areas, and they allow us to stay connected to our data and the world around us. These are not small issues with funny names. They're our link to the broadband future, and we can't get this one wrong. The FCC deregulated special access in 1999, anticipating new competition driving down prices. I probably would have supported deregulation then. But since then, competition has grown, then decimated with MCI and the old AT&T getting purchased by incumbents, then grown again a little bit, but it does not appear to have flourished. The GAO in the Bush administration said that where the FCC has completely deregulated special access prices have gone up. NARUC commissioned a study that concluded, quote, overall, the market concentration data portrays special access as one firm, such as the ILEC, dominates, and other providers, both individually and collectively, have a small market share and little influence on price. The report also said that the time is, quote, certainly ripe for reform. Now, the incumbents say that the markets are highly competitive and that these reports aren't relying on the right data. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but these independent analyses are interesting. I'd like to ask Mr. Schieber, Mr. Meena, and Mr. Irving, can you provide me any examples where a Bell company doesn't hold at least 90% of the market?
Sir, I can't provide any such example. As I've already stated, my testimony and then question and answers here, 96% of our special access circuits are with select. I can't think of a single market where they don't have more than 90%. You know, your comments about this being critical access, as I said in my oral testimony, it's the lifeblood of the industry. And, you know, we in fact see access rates going up as you discussed. Specific example, we have a situation where we've had a 9-year contract with an ILEC. We had to renew that just last week, and I had two choices. I could renew under a new plan that was made available to me at a 28% increase for those circuits, or alternatively, I could elect not to renew under a term volume and term plan, and I'd have to pay 108% more than I had been paying for the last 9 years. So,
Mr. Irving?
We at Cricket have been following the debate carefully. Special access is, in fact, as been discussed, going to become increasingly important as we move to greater capacity and greater data. We're at Cricket very interested in seeing increasing competition in this field, but I'm not specifically aware of our own experience with middle access providers.
Mr. Meena, are you aware of any Bell company that doesn't hold at least 90% of the market?
No, sir. I'm not familiar exactly what the percentages are, but I do know that a free market is defined by willing
Can you
buyer.
pull the microphone up so everyone can hear you?
Yes.
I think everything you're saying is important.
Okay.
And
Well,
especially so because I agree with you. So we went
Okay.
you right in the microphone.
Appreciate that. Yes, I don't know specifically what the percentages are, but I do know that a free market is defined by willing buyers and willing sellers, not seller. And that's what seems to be a bottleneck for my cohorts here. Our big issue is related to devices and roaming, and special access doesn't matter if our customers can't get the devices they need and can't get access to data roaming nationwide.
Mr. Irving, in your testimony, you mentioned several proceedings pending at the FCC that deal with roaming. Can you explain to the committee your understanding of the roaming conditions of the Verizon Wireless-Alltel merger, and in your opinion, do you think those merger conditions have been violated?
I do. In connection with the merger, the wireless merger proceedings, and in fact with all major wireless merger proceedings in the last several years, the issue of roaming has been addressed at has been raised to the FCC. And the reason it's been raised is because mergers of major companies eliminate one of few roaming partners that are available in the industry. The issues with respect to Alltel and Verizon merging, roaming came up. Verizon has a policy of carving out large geographic areas from competitors where they prohibit roaming, and there was concern that the elimination of an Alltel partner would further exacerbate that problem. So, in connection with the in connection with the merger proceeding, the FCC imposed a condition that said that small and mid-sized carriers who dealt with Verizon and Alltel could choose either the Alltel agreement or the Verizon agreement to cover their roaming traffic. Verizon is known for having large geographic carve-outs in which they prohibit roaming. The Alltel agreements didn't have that. And so this merger condition ensured that roaming would be available. Although the condition has been in place, and although the merger has occurred, Verizon is taking the position that not only can they use geographic carve-outs for their own markets, but they are free to do that with Alltel markets also. So I believe that they are violating the condition that the FCC put in place. They're not violating it. They're reserving the right to violate it. They're putting competitors like Leap in a difficult position. We've asked the FCC to clarify, and we hope the FCC will clarify rapidly.
I see my time has expired. I thank the chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Steve, do you want to go? Okay. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for sitting in the chair, and you all for waiting through the votes, and sorry about missing some of the testimony. Let me just ask a simple question. Do you believe the auction of more spectrum with fewer conditions will benefit the consumer? Yes or no? And maybe why, if you got a short answer. Mr. Schieber?
Sir, I'm not a spectrum expert. I'm not sure that I'm qualified.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Irving?
Absolutely, I think the answer is yes. I was prepared to tell the committee that spectrum was the lifeblood of the wireless industry. Special access apparently is the lifeblood, and spectrum also, but we would like to see additional spectrum auctioned off with few conditions so that small and mid-sized carriers can continue to compete.
Great.
Yes, I don't think the name of the game in our industry is necessarily access to any kind of spectrum. Access to low-band spectrum is particularly important. When I say low-band spectrum, I mean 800 megahertz, 700 megahertz. Last year, we were able to acquire 700 megahertz spectrum that we're not able to actually build out because of the issues related to handsets and not having access to automatic roaming, automatic data roaming. And so there's spectrum.
But let me ask, because the question really is about if we place additional conditions on the spectrum that we auctioning off, would that make it more difficult to you in your decision to, to purchase or bid on it?
It just depends on what those special conditions are.
So if we added conditions without a definition, that does change your parameters a little bit.
Well, let me give you an example of specifically what you're asking. We were hoping there would be special conditions tied into the 700 auction that would require automatic data roaming for those who bought, I believe it was the C block spectrum last year. That did not occur. If that special condition had been in place, we were supportive of it. We would have been very pleased if that would have come about.
Okay. Sir?
We believe we're qualified to talk about spectrum as it relates to middle mile. And our opinion is making more spectrum available for middle mile, I think will create more options. And actually targeting
okay, I have limited time, so let me just go to Mr. Murray and then Dr. Ford.
So more spectrum would clearly benefit consumers, but the central tragedy of the last 10 years of policymaking, I would say, is the fact that we had the best opportunity of a swath of spectrum coming up, and who got it? The same two dominant carriers that we're trying to create competition to.
But the question is, if we put restrictions on spectrum,
right? So presumably you're referencing.
Do you like that?
Block. Well, you're referencing, I guess, the C block openness conditions, and I see, if those conditions help the marketplace to move towards more openness, get more devices, more applications out there for consumers, I think that's a net win for consumers, and I actually think.
But obviously, the return on investment from the government on some of the auctions because of restrictions was less.
Well, let's remember this is the public's spectrum. It's actually not the government's spectrum. And what's the value of a public park? Could we presumably earn a little bit more revenue if we sold that land for the public park? Well,
but you also have to remember that people have to put in a lot of capital to make that spectrum worth anything. Otherwise, it's worth nothing.
Right, but some would actually argue the opposite, that in some cases, by putting on certain kinds of conditions, you may actually increase the number of bidders that get into it.
Does anyone agree with that? When you increase, those of you who can't debate this issue, I understand that. But like, Mr. Irving, do you agree that adding additional conditions will bring in more bidders or less bidders?
There are conditions that that could bring in more bidders. Right now we have so it's hard to
Does it restrict the
universe
ability of
of
us to get
conditions.
a better return on the investment of the spectrum if we view it as a public asset that we do sell?
I'm sorry, I apologize, I didn't hear your question.
Well, I mean, if we put conditions, does it inhibit our ability to raise the revenue from the bidders as we specify what goes on there? Let me just move on to another question because I'm.
Could I take a shot at that, please?
No, I just need to go. I got about 4 questions and I've only dealt with one. So, let me just go to Mr. Schieber. How would Carterphone rules requiring all wireless networks to support all devices impact your ability to manage your network?
It would have significant impacts. I'm not a network engineer, but we are very cognizant of managing traffic to ensure that all of our customers have equal access to our network and putting other devices.
And let me just, if I may, Madam Chair, and I'll finish with it. Would service quality be affected?
Very well could be, yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank the panel for your testimony this morning. I've learned a lot, and I find it especially helpful, especially regarding special access and black holes. So I know it's not easy to testify, so I appreciate you coming up here. I'd like to see a competitive marketplace in which the little guy has a chance to become a big guy, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I particularly like your comments, Mr. Murray, that it's not necessarily about over-regulating, but we need to use our oversight authority to haul non-competitive players in here and make them explain themselves in front of us. And that's something that I hope the committee can follow up with. My first question goes to you, Mr. Murray, and you, Dr. Ford. I definitely appreciate your economic perspective on this, but there are a few large telecom players that dominate the field, especially regarding the spectrum, while several smaller companies are clawing it out for the scraps, for the crumbs. How do you propose to run the next auction so that it's more competitive for the little guys to get a part of it? Mr. Murray, could you take that first?
I think, frankly, we just need to look at rules that perhaps have a filter which looks at dominant carriers. If you've already got a ton of spectrum, if you're already massively dominant in the industry, it's possible that we should consider a spectrum block which is a competitive spectrum block.
So that by its very nature, that would get more people to bid if
Exactly.
you were blocking, Mr. Ford, Dr. Ford?
You can hope for some things that you can never have, and this industry is very costly to be in, and you can try to force somebody in it, but that doesn't mean they're going to survive, okay? They're going to have to spend billions of dollars every year to keep that network running. If they cannot generate the business, then all you're doing is waiting for some bigger guy to gobble him up, and you've created a massive inefficiency. Okay, what we have to have in this industry is a dramatic rise in either the market size, the expenditures, and maybe broadband will help with that, or a significant reduction in the cost of the network. And I haven't seen either of those really happen. I mean, we're really at the point now where we're about to lose possibly another wireless carrier, and it's not because of some malfeasance or government incompetence in regulating the industry. It's just that it's too competitive for 4 or 5 people. It's just too competitive. It's just the nature of the business, man.
I mean, like Ms. Eshue, I have a trouble stomaching that, geez, we need to let the bigger players get bigger so that they can spend the money they need to spend the money.
Well, you're going to have to subsidize them
to run the market.
You're going to subsidize them otherwise. That's the only choice, because they're going to lose money. If you have 5 of them beating their brains out, they're going to lose money. They have a debt to pay when they build that network. They have to have revenue to cover that cost. That's the only point. right? That's the only point, and the costs are exceedingly high in this business.
Let Mr.
They got to
Moore make his point.
reinvent
Now, I have
the
a
network
technical
every 5
question,
years.
but I want to move on to a
I
technical
mean,
question.
California alone is the 9th largest economy in the world. Are we seriously suggesting that that can't support an independent, strong carrier? I think LEAP is a testament to that's just not true. And if it was so damn competitive, why is it that profit margins keep creeping up in the midst of a recession? We've got these guys making gangbuster profits in the midst of the rest of the country is really struggling it out. That, to me, says market power. We've got evidence of market power left to right in this industry. We've got anti-competitive behavior, blocking applications, can't get exclusive contracts on handsets, can't get special access. What more evidence do we need that this market needs some oversight?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to a technical question, actually. Mr. Schieber, you said you're not a technical person regarding the spectrum, but you're about to make massive investments in G4, I understand. Is that correct?
Sorry, G4?
Yes.
Oh, 4G.
4G, excuse me.
I'm sorry, yes.
A little
Yes,
dyslexic here
through our a company, Clearwire, that we own a portion of, yes.
So is there a problem with 4G in regard to interference between neighboring portions of the spectrum?
In all honesty, I believe that any time that you have spectrum that butts up against itself, you always run the risk that there is some sort of interference. I know it's something that our engineers deal with on a regular basis.
Is that a particular problem we need to? I mean, 4G has a tremendous amount of bandwidth and content. There must be some spillover that exceeds that of prior generations of technology.
I have not heard anything that indicates that the engineers can't manage the spectrum appropriately to ensure that there's not interference.
Okay, anyone else in the panel have a comment on that question?
I think Mr. Schieber is right. You have that at any spectrum band. You could have bleed over and interference if it's not managed properly. I don't know of any special situations with 4G other than incumbent broadcast TV stations at the 700 megahertz level that there might be some interference with when companies like ourselves offer 4G services at the 700 megahertz band.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired.
All right, thank you, Mr. McNerney. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. Mr. Schieber, my understanding is that more than half of all the backhaul in Europe and Asia is wireless. And if wireless backhaul is successful elsewhere, why doesn't Sprint use it more comprehensively in the U.S., given your partial ownership of Clearwire? What's the issue behind
The majority of the cell sites where we do have an alternative vendor is in fact wireless backhaul. It is a technology that we're seeing an increasing amount of. I mentioned earlier that we work with FiberTower to bring wireless backhaul to our own cell sites. One of the single biggest issues that we're faced with in migrating to wireless backhaul or any other alternative access vendor is the fact that we are subject to very onerous terms and conditions associated with the special access and the middle mile facilities we buy from the ILEC today. We have situations where if we buy too much, we're penalized. If we buy too little, we're penalized. If we want to migrate a circuit from the ILEC to an alternative vendor, we have to pay in excess of $900 in some cases. It's very, very difficult and very onerous to move, and so we have to be very cautious to avoid incurring termination liabilities. And unfortunately, we were forced to sign up for those contracts because without signing up for those contracts, we had to pay even higher rates above and beyond what we're paying today, which, as we've heard today, we already see exorbitant rates of return on special access in the ILECs.
So it's not because T1 lines are so cheap?
No, sir. T1 lines are not cheap. 1/3 of our operating costs associated with operating a cell site are for T1s and the middle mile facilities.
Okay, because your CTO, Barry West, I guess in 2008 made some comment about that T lines are cheap, and that's part of the reason. And so I was just wondering.
In certain parts of the country, in very dense urban areas, If there's a relatively short distance between a cell site and a Lex central office, you may very well see some less expensive T1s, but it is not a cheap technology for us to buy.
Okay. Dr. Ford, you were making some comments about just the extraordinary cost of whoever's building this out over time and the need to get return on that. Mr. Murray, I think, had a little different perspective on that in terms of, I think your line was the gangbuster profits right now. And I'm curious, Dr. Ford, if you want to respond to that.
Well, I mean, I don't see any evidence of gangbuster profits. I mean, you could say, well, there's gangbuster profits in special access. Well, I thought we were talking about the wireless industry, and there are 4 or 5 wireless carriers in California. I mean, there is enough market in places for that to exist, and there are areas we heard earlier from members of the subcommittee where I don't have enough wireless, right? And there are rural areas where the markets are very small, but the cost of deploying the network is not that much different, or even higher in rural areas. So the economics drives this thing. I mean, you cannot just say, I want more competition. The economics are going to tell you whether or not you can have what you want. So in the end, firm profits are the only reasonable measure of how competitive the business is. Because for any given product may be above cost, any given product may be below cost. So it's across the whole scheme of the business venture that you have to measure the competitiveness or profitability of the business.
Well, I'll tell you, it seems like this Congress and administration have certainly have an attitude of nationalizing everything once it is broke, so I hope we don't create something else to go after. And of the 90, I think I read in some testimony 99% of America has access to cell phone cellular coverage right now. I must be the winner then of that 1%, because up until a year ago, at least 2 county seats, well, at least one I know of for sure in my districts, did not have cell phone coverage. U.S. Cellular came in there, and I know they're considering another town in my district. And there are still lots of these rural areas where we don't even have one carrier. And it wouldn't be fair, Mr. Murray, if I didn't let you respond now to what Dr. Ford said.
There's a lot to respond there, sir. One thing I would say is I don't see this at all as moving away from a market economy. In fact, this is quite the opposite. This is how can we maintain free markets? How can we maintain competition? That's what I'm saying. My perspective has always been I prefer competition to regulation. And in this market, while we do have some competition, there are really clear indicators that there are market power. And the Department of Justice uses things like 4-firm concentration ratios, HHI indices. The fact of the matter is those numbers have been creeping steadily up in this industry. And to complement that consolidation trend, we see evidence of abuse. And so all I'm saying is in order so that we can have a free market and have these companies stay strong, thrive, what we need to do is make sure that the dominant carriers aren't abusing their market power. This has been the story of competition for more than a century.
All right, Mr. Irving, do you want to just respond? And then
yes, very quickly. I'd just like to point out that I think small and medium carriers help make the industry vibrant and innovative and competitive. And what I'd like to see is I'd like to make sure that to the extent that there are forces essentially tending toward elimination or marginalization of small and medium carriers, that we act to address those forces so that we can continue to be innovative driving forces in the industry.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence on the time.
Thank the gentleman who's always so thoughtful and well prepared. Dr. Ford, you talked about California. You mentioned this. I want to set something down for the record here. Now, according to the GAO report on special access, in Silicon Valley, most specifically San Jose, California, perhaps the most data-hungry area of the world, competitors have access to only 6.2% of all buildings. To put it another way, the incumbent provider, AT&T, is the only provider of access in 93.8% of all buildings. So if you think that's competitive, I'll eat my hat. I mean, but this is so worthwhile to drill down into this. But
Is that a
I
question,
just
or-
wanted to get that on the record. No, I'm going to recognize now the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Booyer, for 7 minutes.
Testimony again. Your word duopoly sort of stuck in my mind, and so I was trying to think of other industries in our country that have that type of system. I was thinking about the tire industry, perhaps. There are industries out there that are have really dominant players. You might want to call them duopolies, but they really aren't. So you've got Coke and Pepsi, right? And then a whole bunch of others.
Right. Yes.
And that's exactly what you have here, too. So I don't know, maybe I don't want to be a lawyer and be nitpicking at your testimony here.
I don't agree with that.
You can't say duopoly and then can't count. Okay, so whoever wrote that for you can't count. So don't call it a duopoly.
Yeah,
that's the only point I'd like to make. It's an easy thing to, fine. It's an easy thing to throw out there. I'm just being very cautious to you. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is that.
Move your microphone.
Okay. When I was in college, I walked on to play football at Ole Miss. There were 2 scholarship quarterbacks and 5 walk-ons. Were there really 7 quarterbacks or 2? And
7?
No, I tell you there were 2, because there were only 2 that got to go to the scrimmages, 2 that got to put the game jerseys on, and those type of things. Yeah, you could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
I
6,
see.
7.
So the other 5 didn't make the other 2 better players?
No, sir. Here's why. Here's the example.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to University of Mississippi, but let me finish, please, sir. The 2 that are duopolistic in our industry have built their companies on low band spectrum, 850 megahertz, and have put together licenses throughout the nation on the most attractive beachfront property spectrum. And when the auctions occurred last year, where more of that spectrum, low band spectrum, was let or was auctioned, they were able to acquire more and more of that. That allowed them to continue to build their business on the best spectrum possible in the wireless industry.
All right, let me reclaim.
And that's the advantage they have.
Let me reclaim my time then, because I'm getting a sense then that you would believe that all wireless carriers should have equal access to precisely the same type of wireless headset, regardless of who made it. Is that what you believe?
What's that?
Is that what you believe?
I do believe that every wireless user should have.
I'm trying to figure out what you believe.
Okay.
Then if that is the belief, and you're asking us to adopt that belief, where is the incentive to collaborate and innovate and create differentiating products?
I tell you where the incentive is in competition. These manufacturers want to sell every device they possibly can. For example, iPhone. iPhone today is limited to just selling to AT&T customers. Manufacturers desire to sell their product, just like we desire to sell our products.
Well, if in fact we had a paradigm, actually strike the word paradigm, if we had a predicate of your belief, where is the incentive for someone to join and put at-risk capital into the marketplace to create a new? That's the iPhone. And so when you have someone who actually wants to innovate, do something new and different, and create something new and different, it excites the consumer, and then everybody goes chasing after the mark.
Sure. All smartphones.
Will you agree with that?
I do agree with that, and I can even add on to that.
Well, then if you agree to that, explain to me how that is congruent to your predicate.
Here's how it's congruent, is that all users want access to the latest and greatest devices, especially smartphones this day. We're seeing a great migration from the plain old cellular phones to smartphones, including iPhones. BlackBerries are another example of that. Our average revenue per user in smartphones is $10 less than other companies' average revenue per user. If you have one company that has one device, they do not have that opportunity to take advantage of the price differential that we might offer and others might offer.
You know, I could use your same analogy into the pharmaceutical market. Mm-hmm. You know, we deal with these exclusivity arrangements. When someone goes to the marketplace and they take the risk meaning they're willing to also accept the loss of the marketplace. And when they have a blockbuster drug or you have a blockbuster product, then everyone dives for the product, and they want access to it, and they demand their access, and then they demand their subjective belief under an objective standard called fairness, and they want us or the FCC to determine it. Okay. The reality is that I suppose King Solomon so long ago said when it comes to human vice, in particular greed, that there is nothing new under the sun. Now let's be pretty doggone honest with each other. That's what this is about. It's about money. It's about how we gain access to that dollar and want to chase it. We want to benefit from somebody else's investment, so would we be just as equally willing to pay for their loss for products that don't make it on the market? The answer is no. That's the reality. The answer is no.
Let me tell you.
So no, time out. I understand your predicate. I disagree with your philosophy, respectfully. I want to protect the marketplace is what I want to protect. So as you look out there and you say, okay, not only is AT&T having exclusivity with the iPhone, Sprint with the Palm Pre, Verizon, BlackBerry Storm, T-Mobile now hooking up with an agreement with Google. And if these companies want to do this and they are creating products for which consumers like, and it's new and it's innovative, I think it's pretty healthy. That's what I look at. I think it is something that's very healthy. I want to ask this question to, where's mine? Let me turn to Dr. Ford. Help me here. If Congress were to say that we would ban exclusivity, do a prohibition of exclusivity agreements, what would be the impact upon innovation and true competitiveness in the marketplace?
Well, I think
I'm sorry, I called you Mr. Ford. It's Dr. Ford.
That's fine. The wireless industry, a lot of the competition in the wireless industry occurs in the device. I mean, most of the commercials you see on television are talking about the device. So the device is a very important component of competition in that industry. Plus, they're giving it to you a lot of times. They're giving it to you for a very low price. So that's a very important piece. So they want to be able to differentiate in that piece to attract business. But necessity is the mother of invention. And when AT&T came out with the iPhone, every single manufacturer was working exceedingly hard to try to match the quality of that product. Whether or not, and Apple drove this. It wasn't the wireless industry. Okay? This was Apple's decision. And whether or not that was a wise decision for Apple, I don't know. You could go either way. AT&T had to upgrade its network significantly to handle that. In terms of maybe not as much investment, they didn't put in as much as they needed to, given the enormous demands that device puts on the network. But I think unquestionably in this industry, if you prohibit that kind of arrangement, that you're going to reduce competition. But I think their point may be a little different in the sense that I'm out here in this rural area and I'm not really competing in that space. But I don't think that, there's the issue also of whether or not a carrier would say, I'm going to make a device for you if you can't sell 5 million of them. It may not be efficient for the manufacturer to sell to very small firms. So it might not necessarily be an issue with the big carriers trying to keep other people from their goodies.
Congressman, if I may.
I only have one comment. My time has expired. So if the chair would indulge me, I would note that out of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development of all of the countries, the United States has the most minutes of use, lowest revenue per minute, and the least concentrated market and what I would say the most efficient use of spectrum of any of the countries. So,
and consumers pay more in this country than any other country, right?
Geez.
But it's a fixed
cost. If we use more, we pay more. Hello?
Sir.
Hello?
Here's my question for you. Is it
if you want the best
industry?
And you get the most efficient use out of the spectrum and you use it a lot, you're going to pay more. It is a free market enterprise system.
And that's why we're all moving towards unlimited.
I'll conclude with that. Wow.
I guess I'd.
Wow, this really did something for the volume. I have a bill on advertising volume that blows people out of the room. Thank you, Mr. Boyer. I just want to make a comment about what's tied to what. We have many successful companies in the country that really aren't tied to other services. TiVo? How many people in the room use TiVo? How about IMAX, Slingbox, Xbox? So the notion that there has to be a nexus between the two, I don't necessarily buy into. We've got some very good examples of that. Mr. Murray, did you want to, you started to say something, and I'd like to give you time to answer, and anyone else that's on the panel. There isn't any other member to call on, so we've got a few minutes here, and
briefly,
then
I wanted
we'll
to
adjourn.
address Mr. Boyer's point, which was the network is not the innovator here. It is the handset company who's doing the innovation, and I challenge the premise that is a free market, that we're going to maximize returns to that handset manufacturer by telling them, limit the universe of people that you can contract with. That is just fundamentally wrong. If we want to maximize the incentive for people to build sexy new devices, let them sell it to everybody. The only reason that manufacturers have not come out against these exclusive deals is because they're scared of the retribution that they will get back from the carriers. The carriers are not innovating here. It's the handset manufacturers, and it's just wrong if we say we're going to maximize their incentives by limiting the universe of people that they can sell to.
Don't they work together?
Well, the gentleman hasn't been recognized.
Most of that innovation is coming from the manufacturers. Most of it's coming from the manufacturers.
Anyone else want to chime in on this?
Can I speak to the pharmaceutical issue?
Quickly.
In a rural area, what if there was just one, let's just say there was a Walgreens and not a CVS, and Walgreens had and CVS had access to a life-saving drug. Is it not fair for those who live in the rural area to have access to that life-saving drug? And that's what we're dealing with here. Is it not fair that those who live in rural areas not have access to the latest and greatest devices?
Well, I think that today's hearing has been highly instructive. And there obviously are divergent views on the committee, but I think that we have not just skirted along the surface, we've really dipped our wings into the important issues here. And I think the area of special access is something that deserves a great deal of attention, not only by the Congress, but by the FCC. And I hope that, again, that the FCC, the new composition of the FCC will come together soon. There's an enormous amount of work to be done there, and some very clear thinking about what competition, what the state of competition is in the United States of America. We're all for competition. I mean, it's in the DNA of every American. But if, well, I won't editorialize that. So I want to thank the audience. You've been a patient one. I don't know if we've so mesmerized you by the great content of the hearing, or that you're employed by some of the interests here. But whatever, it's nice to see that the room remained full. I want to ask for unanimous consent to keep the record open for 10 days for members to submit their opening statements and follow-up questions. And also the chairman, not the acting chairwoman, the chairman has also included AT&T and Verizon to submit statements for the record, which I find very interesting, but that's what he'd like to do. They didn't testify today, but they're going to be allowed to submit statements for the record. So that's the unanimous consent request, and not hearing any objections. So be the order, and the subcommittee will now adjourn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Thanks.